Christians have been increasingly discouraged by the droves of people walking away from the church, deconstructing and labeling themselves as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, instead of claiming faith. Yet our guest today is actually convinced that we may be witnessing the birth of a new kind of conversation about belief. That even in the midst of a post-Christian secular age, there is a growing wave of people discovering why God makes sense of science, history, culture, and the search for meaning. And people are actually returning to Christianity. Is that happening? Why? And is the church prepared to welcome them back? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. As many of you know, this is an offshoot of Theology on Tap, an organization here in Houston for now, where we gather together all kinds of folks over good craft beer and good food, and we talk about interesting topics around theology, faith and culture, anything that's juicy enough to have some disagreement about. We spar a little bit, we drink a beer, and we try to introduce people to Jesus and invite them to follow him. And then here in the podcast, we get to nerd out a little bit more, and we're going to especially get nerdy today because we're excited that our guest today is someone that I've been actually listening to and watching for a long time. But before we get to that, I'm Sarah Stone. I'm the executive director for Theology on Tap, joined by Evan McClanahan, the senior pastor at First Lutheran here in Midtown, where we have our lovely studio. And our guest today, if you're watching, you may already recognize his face, is Justin Brierley. That name might mean something to some of you if you've ever listened to the Unbelievable podcast. Based in the UK, Justin was host of the popular radio show and podcast Unbelievable, and now has started a new endeavor called Re-Enchanting Podcast with the Center for Cultural Witness in London. He's passionate about creating thoughtful conversations around faith with both Christians and skeptics. He lives in Surrey, England with his wife, Lucy, and their 4 children. And his second book, ta-da, which we'll be talking about today, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, will be out in September, which I think will align pretty well with when this comes out. So go and order the book. Justin, your first book was about how after all of these conversations with atheists and agnostics, you're still a believer, which I devoured. But this is your second one. And I have some more questions about this one. So we're going to get into it, but welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I'm actually coming out to Houston at some point in September.
What?
So I don't know if
we'd love to visit with you.
Yeah.
Are you coming to visit Lakewood? I know you came to visit Lakewood once before. So
no,
I remember that episode. You talked about how nice all the ushers were.
That was many years ago when I visited Lakewood Church with good old Joel Hosteen. But no, it's actually a church called the Story Church that I'm coming to.
The Story,
yeah. So yeah, we're looking forward to that in September.
Yeah, the Story's a great church.
My son played baseball with that pastor's son. So
there you go.
Yeah. And let me just say quickly, when I really got into apologetics, like 2012, I'm sure you've heard the story a lot, but it was like I stumbled on Unbelievable, then went like through the back catalog, right? So like downloaded like 50, 60, 70, 100 episodes or something, like vacuuming. I was like doing yard work, constantly like Justin was in my ear with his guests. So yeah, so it's really cool to talk to you. But
oh, it's really nice to be here. I absolutely love listening, meeting people who have been listeners for years and years, because I know what it is like, because I listen to a lot of podcasts, and you kind of get to feel like you know someone after listening that long. But it's always wonderful to meet folks who've been listening for a while.
I have a funny story about the Unbelievable podcast. I met somebody, we actually dated for a little bit, who, actually, I'll pause on that. Years before, I had listened to an Unbelievable episode where there was it was so interesting. And there was a nugget in there that I'd never known about a particular Bible story. I then stole that nugget and taught, I didn't steal it. I gave, credit, but I taught that to my women's Bible study. And they were all like, oh, wow, I never thought about it this way. This is so cool. Years later, met this guy and he started talking. I'm like, man, I heard something really, really similar on an episode of Unbelievable. And he said, no, that was me. I was on the episode. It was Ted. Yeah, it was really funny. I was like, this has come full circle. Anyway,
wow.
You're doing great work. Tell us, so some of our listeners are like, what is Unbelievable? I don't even know who this guy is. You should, but tell us a little bit just about you, your story, how maybe you came to faith, and then how you started Unbelievable. And then we'll climb into this stuff.
Sure. Well, I came to faith really having grown up in a Christian family, but sort of finding faith myself in my mid-teens. Went off to university, but quickly ran into, some quite full-on skepticism there, and really began the process of discovering what I later came to know was called apologetics, so the sort of rational defense of the Christian faith, and really I pursued that interest into my adult career. So I started as a radio journalist, a radio show presenter. And a few years in, having started at Premier Christian Radio here in the UK, I launched The Unbelievable Show, which was really my attempt to have conversations, good conversations between Christians and non-Christians about why they might want to consider whether Christianity makes sense. And yeah, that I was the host of The Unbelievable Show for over 17 and a half years, believe it or not. So it was a wonderful way to really get sort of into the arguments for and against Christianity, really develop my own case for faith. And I was able to write a book a few years ago that sort of spelled out my case for faith, called Unbelievable: Why, After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. Well, it's been a bit longer than that now, and I'm still a Christian. It's been a wonderful ride, and just such a privilege to host all of those conversations along the way, and kind of develop my own understanding of faith and so on as I've been on that journey.
Yeah, I wonder, did any of those conversations actually sway you somewhere differently in your, do you have any times where you thought, I believed one thing, and then after this conversation really had to kind of take a 180?
Oh yeah. Totally. Yeah. There's been so many conversations that I've hosted, which have definitely either nudged me in a different direction or had definitely had an influence of some kind. So yeah, I can think of several issues that I probably took one perspective on when I began the show, and landed in a different place, when by the time I finished presenting the show. Likewise, I don't know, there are even some issues I just never had an opportunity to think about, to be honest. When I first started the show, I was only in my early 20s after all, and there were still a lot of things I just didn't know much about. And so in a way it was a sort of theology education in itself, but hearing lots of different perspectives from different theologians and so on. So yeah, there's definitely been lots of ways in which my own faith has been shaped by hosting that show for so long.
I love that. So, okay, I read a bulk of this new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and I hope you're right. We're gonna get into it a little bit, but tell us kind of what led you to start investigating this trend. You talk about a lot of, secular thinkers becoming newly open to Christianity, whether they actually take the full dive in or not. So what led you to kind of start investigating this idea?
I guess it was partly just seeing the way that the tone of the conversations shifted in the last several years of doing Unbelievable, because it very much began at the time that new atheism was gaining a head of steam. So people like Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris were writing these best-selling books, against God. We were seeing the birth of this internet movement, which was, bringing atheists together, rallies, conferences. We even had a kind of atheist bus campaign here in the UK and that sort of thing. And so that was a time when there was very much this kind of anti-theistic rhetoric that was, quite common among secular thinkers and public intellectuals. And in a way, the church was responding to that. And my Unbelievable Show was responding to that. And we were hosting those kinds of quite combative debates. But then I noticed really the tenor of the debates changing in the last several years. It just felt like somehow the new atheist movement ran out of steam for all kinds of reasons. And I started to notice that a lot of the public intellectuals who were now drawing a crowd were actually quite open to Christianity, were quite sympathetic to its claims, or at least its value as a cultural phenomenon. And so as I started to see that and started to feature more and more conversations with people who weren't anti-Christianity, weren't aggressively against religion, but were more open to discussing the value and benefits of Christianity, I started to see this change in the way that they were, willing to talk about the subject. At the same time, I was seeing some really interesting stories of thinking adult converts to Christianity, quite surprising ones. And I just started to wonder whether this might be the telltale signs that maybe people are starting to, I guess, grow tired of the atheist secular narrative, that actually there might be a point in time where once you've run out of other options, or you've tried all the other stories, that you might end up people might start to gravitate back towards the Christian story, which for me is the kind of the story of all stories, the story that undergirds so many of the other smaller stories that people are telling themselves. So there were a number of different things that sort of led me to sort of put together, as you rightly say, Sarah, it's quite a sort of optimistic thesis. And I'm not saying that we're suddenly going to be due for some massive revival and all the churches will be full again or anything like that. But I just wondered whether we're starting to see the tide kind of turning on the secular materialist kind of way of thinking about life in the West.
Yeah. You mentioned the new atheists, and I had a question on here to ask you about who they are and what they're about. You kind of mentioned it. But my question is, it seems like there was a time where you had all these debates happening with Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and Harris and all these guys. And the question on the table was something like, does God exist? And it seems like we've kind of moved away. Maybe that question has sort of morphed into, okay, maybe he exists, but is he good? Is he worth following? And the question seems to be shifting again. I didn't give you this question ahead of time, so maybe you don't have an answer at the ready, but what do you think is now kind of the reigning question or obstacle for especially, say, like young millennials and Gen Zs? I'm asking partly as a mom, but partly just out of curiosity. Like, it feels to me like they don't care as much about his existence. So all of the apologetics about, the cosmological argument, all these kind of things are like, I totally
agree.
Even his goodness. I don't know. Do you know
I absolutely agree. I think you're dead on. I think, as you say, the God question, does God exist, was the thing that was being debated by the new atheists quite frequently. But as you say, I think younger millennials, Gen Z, that question is very secondary, and far more primary are questions around if someone does have an interest in God, it's kind of, well, is Christianity good for us? Is it sort of something that I actually would want to commit my life to? But secondly, I think for a lot of people who just perhaps don't have any association almost with Christianity, the questions they're asking are simply, what do I do with my life? What makes me want to get up in the morning? Who am I? I think there are lots of questions of identity, circulating in culture at the moment. And so it all comes back to sort of purpose and meaning and value and identity, and all of that, in my opinion, goes back to the God question. But it's certainly not where young people especially are starting these days, I'd say.
Well, that's a perfect segue then to my next question. As I was reading, I really like this part, and I know Evan would probably be amening it too, because we've had lots of conversations about like kids and smartphones and all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to read a couple snippets. I'm on page 47 and 48. I got a advanced copy, which is pretty cool, except it has this big thing across the top, like, this isn't real,
I actually have the proper version now in my hands.
So that's exciting.
What you don't have, Sarah, in your one is the foreword by N.T. Wright, which is very exciting.
Wow.
So you're going to have to get yourself, the official version at some point.
Well played. For the foreword, maybe I can just pay like $5 and just get the foreword. No, okay. Yeah. But you're talking here about kind of that God or religion kind of gives people this cosmic sense of order and sacred structure. And then you say that there's a loss of shared identity. And that's part of the reason for the modern mental health crisis. And then the part that I starred on the next page says, the stories we have been told for the last half century about discovering our, quote, true selves, or a different spot you say our authentic selves, have reached a crescendo in the age of social media, yet most of us are not mentally or spiritually equipped to navigate this brave new world. So I guess my question is, tell us a little bit about how, this search for the, quote, authentic self and is kind of rewiring our brains. You talk about it rewiring us, and that it's contributing to this mental health crisis. You just talked about identity, meaning, purpose. It's a big question, but how is kind of the current culture that we live in, given all of the electronic, advances, how's that changing the way we think about those things?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people have already documented the way that is affecting, especially young people's attention spans, the way in which it is actually quite a force for polarization in our culture, as we tend to gravitate towards our echo chambers and so on, on these social media apps. But I think generally it does create a huge burden on young people, especially who are the digital natives and who are used to now curating their life or engaging with a lot of their relationships through social media, through digital. And I think the issue for me is that there's both the kind of the technological element, which I think makes it harder for people to have and nurture the kinds of deep relationships that you're able to in a one-to-one relationship. Whereas you're having to navigate sort of multiple relationships with many people, across the, in this digital world. And I think that takes its own kind of burden, just the technological demands of that. But I think there's also that identity piece as well, which is that we are, increasingly in social media terms, curating a certain identity online. And for a lot of young people, I think that as well can be incredibly draining, because they're being asked to kind of, become, project to the world this fascinating personality. You've got to have, a uniqueness in all these different ways. You've got to kind of show how you kind of compare with your peers. And I do partly see this as why there is kind of this search for increasingly sort of, new sort of forms of identity in the world of social media and among young people, because it feels like there's a sort of sense in which your identity is now free floating and you've got lots of options in front of you, but there can be a kind of paralysis that comes with that, because we're not actually, it's never been the case before that we've had to sort of create an identity for ourselves from scratch, be it, sexuality or gender or all manner of other things that sort of we might use to describe ourselves. And I think that in itself is a really difficult thing. I think, and for me, so it goes kind of back to before the technology kind of really accelerated all of this. It goes back to the fact that for me, we've lost essentially the Judeo-Christian sort of story that essentially shaped people's lives and their identity in the past. And even if they didn't explicitly kind of recognize that, it was just the fact that you kind of saw yourself within a certain type of story. You saw yourself in a story that had a very specific beginning, a place where you are now, and it has a kind of an end to it. And there's a sort of, there's a narrative there that you can sort of essentially locate yourself in. Whereas I think that's all gone away now for many young people. They don't have that kind of a fixed narrative or a shared story that they see themselves as part of with others. And because they now are kind of more free floating entities, I think it puts a lot more stress on young people to kind of create a story for themselves. And so that's why that's my kind of diagnosis for why, there is, it's part of the reason I think why we are seeing those very concerning statistics around mental health, depression, anxiety, suicide among young men is at its highest, that it's ever been really in the Western world. And it's, there has to be a reason for this. And you can kind of see the way the graphs basically, line up with the point at which social media came into came on the scene. But I think there'd been a kind of an identity crisis brewing for quite a while before that. It's just that social media kind of really accelerated it in that way.
Yeah. Well, the mobilization to the world. So it's like we don't grow up in the same village. Well, I'm from Surrey because my grandparents are from Surrey and their grandparents are from Surrey, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all sort of like free agents. It seems like we can all move, we can all travel, we can all go where we want. We're not really connected to any place. And that has to take a toll as well, I would think. So, because the faith is part of what's, passed down within the family. So,
I think there's a kind of disconnectedness that exists now in our culture. And I see psychologists like John Vervaeke talking about this. He's termed this phrase the meaning crisis, essentially, which is a combination of, the way that technology has accelerated it, but really it's also about the fact that we've lost a kind of narrative that religion very often gave us. Now, he's not a religious person himself per se, but he does recognize that there are things, that there's a kind of a way of life and that a religious story gives people, which is very hard to replicate outside of that. And when you do lose all those other aspects of community, the kind of roots that you put down in one place, when we become all completely socially mobile and everything else, it's much harder, I think, to kind of get that sense of who we are and our sort of place in the world.
Well, there's a bunch of, at least I'm looking at teenagers. I have teenagers that just feel unmoored. And I like the way you put it. I pictured as you were talking, that you're just sort of this free floating sort of soul in a space, and you are then picking these elements and creating your own identity, which at the outset sounds kind of cool. but is actually terrifying, because now you're responsible for who you are, how you interact with the world, how people see you. And we do have some responsibility about that, but we do believe that we start with something. You know what I mean? We believe that we were created, that we were made in God's image, we're loved by God, rescued by God, all of these things that give us some kind of anchor. And then from there, we can decide, like, you know, some of these other little pieces, like, do I like board games or whatever? But now it's just like, am I even human? What does that mean?
Well, and the gender question comes in all that too.
Yep.
Let me name 3 names, though, going back to like the kind of 4 horsemen of the new atheist apocalypse and how maybe they've kind of faded a little bit. So say Peter Boghossian,
James, talked about him,
James Lindsay, and Jordan Peterson.
That was my next question, was about Jordan Peterson.
Okay. So these are guys that seem to have kind of moved into that cultural space. They're not Christians, but they're open to Christianity. And it's like they're giving credit to Christianity for building the good world. And the new atheists sort of offered nothing. So maybe that ties into the next question. But I was just thinking, you know, these public intellectuals who have kind of come about, and they're not Christian, but they, you know, it's almost like atheism sort of played itself out there for a while. And it's like, well, where does this get you? Well, actually, it gets you nowhere. So let's re-examine how we got to where we were. And let's see, maybe we can start from there.
That's literally in the book, what you just said.
Okay.
Are you sure that Evan didn't ghostwrite this? No.
I mean, it's exactly what you described there, Evan. I mean, the way I put it in the book was, having sort of torn God down, they didn't really replace God with anything. And you do need something positive. You can't just live on the idea that God doesn't exist, or even the kind of, one of the things they did try to replace God with was science and reason, but those are very limited things to actually build a kind of positive ethic for life on. And to that extent, I think the reason that we've seen the likes of Jordan Peterson become so popular is because suddenly he was someone who wasn't denying God, but was actually saying, here's a way you could structure your life. Here's something that you could positively do. And the by and large, the new atheists didn't do that. And when some of the new atheists did get around to doing it, they went in very different directions as to what that would look like. So you went with the sort of the more conservative end, who kind of were responding to the rise of woke ideologies and so on, people like Lindsay and Boghossian, and you went with those who went on completely the other side, who were very much into social justice issues, like P.Z. Myers and many others. And they just had very, very different remedies for what life should look like without God. And I think that was the problem with the new atheism. It identified a problem, you know, God doesn't exist and religion's bad for you, but it didn't give people any kind of solutions to what to do with their life after that point.
Interesting. You talked in the book about Jordan Peterson. I want to talk a little bit about Peterson. He's a fascinating character to me. I remember, I don't know how long ago it was, but it was less than 3 years ago that I read a headline that said, Jordan Peterson needs 3 more years to decide if Jesus was God. Oh my goodness. That's a thorough research process. But he seems to be, you use this term, I think, kind of a gateway drug to thinking about, or maybe you didn't use the term, but I have it written here that he's the gateway drug to Christianity, especially for young men. And I know people like this that loved his, what was it, like 12 steps to like being a man.
12 rules for life.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's better. It was like, you know,
women
make your bed.
Women could read it too. Women can read it too.
They can, or women can give it to the men they want to be.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Like, please do start making.
Honey, make your bed. Jordan Peterson says so. The lobsters evolved to make their bed.
That's right. Yeah. But talk a little bit maybe about Jordan Peterson and why he has such a broad appeal. Hey guys, Sarah here. Sorry to interrupt the podcast. I know it was awesome, but I just wanted to tell you that Theology on Tap is growing. We are now a standalone ministry, an independent nonprofit, and to grow, we need your help. We're offering more live events, more follow-up opportunities to reach the unchurched, and increased partnerships with local churches. You can help us grow by praying for us, by telling your friends or church about us, and of course, partnering with us financially. To donate, go to houstontot.com/give. Okay, enjoy the rest of the show.
And I will say, I'll caveat this with the fact he's a controversial character, Jordan Peterson. Not everyone likes his stuff, and you know, he has more of a kind of campaigning sort of I guess politicized kind of view that comes out more with his social media postings. But I think what he really rose to fame with was his sort of appeal, as you say, to a lot of young men. And it was really, his kind of life lessons were psychological essentially, but they were really couched in the language of scripture. drawing on ancient wisdom. You know, I mean, it's hard to imagine anyone else selling out, you know, an auditorium, you know, for weeks on end talking about Genesis. But he did that. You know, he became this cult figure. He kind of really grew into public popularity in sort of 2018. I had him on my Unbelievable show to kind of discuss the question, can we make sense of life without God, opposite an atheist psychologist called Susan Blackmore. And if you would just you know, listen to him without knowing much about him, you probably would have thought he was a Christian apologist. He really was there defending the Christian worldview, the idea that we really can't make sense of human value and dignity without, you know, the first chapter of Genesis, that we're made in the image of God. So he's a remarkable character in that way, just because he has been so incredibly popular, massively popular as a speaker, you know, on his YouTube channel, on his podcast, and yet dispensing advice that is very much, steeped in the Christian tradition in that sense. Now, as an individual himself, he's hard to nail down as to his specific views on God. When I asked him about this on the show, he gave an answer he's given other people, which is, well, it depends what you mean by God. And he kind of goes down a sort of quite psychological Jungian kind of way of defining what God is.
An archetype, is it?
So, it's the, you know, the prevailing archetype of, you know, of your greatest set of, you know, priorities or whatever. But what he said to me was, I live my life as though God exists, essentially. So I think he finds it difficult to kind of be pressed on exactly what his beliefs are about this, you know, but he certainly thinks you can tell what someone really believes by the way they act, I guess is his point. And he says he tries to live his life as though God exists. And so he's been a fascinating character. But I think, as you say, wherever he lands on the spectrum, he has been this gateway drug, actually, for a lot of people, just to take Christianity more seriously. I mean, there are so many examples that I ran across as I was researching the book of people who basically said, yeah, I'm basically a Christian now. And Jordan Peterson opened the door to me taking the Bible more seriously. You know, and he's probably the most preeminent example of these sort of secular thinkers who are, as I say, considering Christianity again. But I think he was kind of the beginning of a trend that I started to notice of other public intellectuals starting to talk about Christianity, take it really seriously, and kind of changing the conversation generally in the whole area.
Yeah. Maybe this is a question more for the end of the interview, but we can just put it on the back burner. I wonder with people like Jordan Peterson and others that are saying, I live as if Christianity is true. If they get, and maybe this is the sort of last barrier between not being a Christian and being a Christian, that what that means is it's a total surrender to Christ, right? Like there's a difference between believing that God is real, right? Even the demons believe, all that kind of stuff, like believing that he's real, believing that the best practices for life are things like forgiveness and kindness and these kind of things. But Jesus asks us for our whole lives, right? Like that's the cost of discipleship is a full surrender. And so maybe we can get to that later on, but I guess, I mean, that's just a concern of mine. I'm hopeful that your book is right. And you do give some examples of people that have actually gone, you know, full tilt the other way. But one question I had, which is not on the prescribed list here, but it seems like with people like you talk about Dave Rubin, you talk about Barry Weiss, of course, we just talked about Jordan Peterson, there are others. It almost feels like a return to Judeo-Christian faith and conservative politics seem to go hand in hand. I know we don't want to make maybe too many sparks, though we actually like making a lot of sparks about this kind of thing, but you're all the way across the pond, so you have nothing to fear. Do you have any thoughts on that connection, why that might be?
I think it's true that there is that a lot of probably the most well-known characters tend to lean conservative when the ones who are sort of taking religion seriously again and that kind of thing, and that may partly be because I think it's partly because of the reasons why they're taking religion seriously again. A lot of those characters are people who are appreciating the value, the stability, if you will, of the Judeo-Christian tradition and what it has done in the West. And to that extent, I think they're naturally conservative politically as well. They're about conserving, you know, the traditions and the things that have, in their view, you know, made the West a successful, flourishing place. So to that extent, it's perhaps unsurprising that you will find that those who kind of most revere the Judeo-Christian tradition are those who tend to be more, you know, socially conservative as well in that respect. Now, that doesn't necessarily, give license to every political sort of position that they take on those things. Having said that, I do mention at least a couple of examples of people in the book who are, I would argue, arguably more sort of left wing in terms of their social or political leanings, but still are recognizing a kind of, are still opening up the God question. So one example might be Russell Brand, who's a well-known sort of comedian and so on, who I wouldn't describe exactly as a sort of right-wing conservative exactly himself, but he's another of these interesting people who has really been pushing against a kind of materialist atheist perspective and asking people to consider the God question again. There's another sort of literary critic and sort of social sort of critic here in the UK called Terry Eagleton, who's very interesting, much more left-wing sort of thinker, but who likewise is asking the question, can we live without something like God, without belief in God? So it's not exclusively conservative leaning, but I think you're absolutely right to identify that those who are sort of seeing the value of Christianity from a social perspective are those who are probably more inclined conservatively in their politics as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's even been, so you kind of had the new atheist movement and it maybe kind of petered out, but since then I think there have been several cataclysmic almost events that have led people to go, wait, maybe I need to rethink things. And one was COVID and lockdowns and the censorship, policies around Twitter and that whole kerfuffle. I think a lot of people were like, wait a minute, these kind of values of tolerance that have already sort of taken for granted, or, democratic free speech, or, open platforms, et cetera. What is kind of the origin of those things? I think there was a number of people who are like, we're losing this kind of Christian society I've enjoyed when, the government can say collude with a private company to sort of silence particular points of view. So, there are other issues as well. I think the trans issue is a huge issue as well. I think more than the gay lesbian, marriage debates, the trans issue is beyond, and talk about, personal identity, right? Trying to find yourself. That is wrapped up in that big time, in a world, where does a lost soul go, but to where they can be affirmed, where they can be, well, I would argue in some cases recruited into a world where it's like, no, this is who you really are. This is your true identity. It's constant. It's one identity crisis after another. So I think that the, J.K. Rowling, arguing, about what feminism is, and, the trans issue coming so quickly to the forefront with such a kind of militaristic, demand that you recognize who I am. Of course, Jordan Peterson was at the head of that, 2016, 2017, whenever that was. So I think that's an issue where a lot of people they're kind of like, well, I'm kind of a, mainline liberal, and, I'm kind of a half-hearted Christian. And then it was like, whoa, this is where this is leading.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think? Is that,
I think that, yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of these issues have become sort of, they've ramped up basically, haven't they, in the last several years? And I think they've increasingly led people to ask, well, where are we heading? How do we define what a human is, and how do we make sense of, whether there is a sort of specific way that life is supposed to be lived? And yeah, I think you're right. And I think COVID definitely had that impact here in the UK. I think it led a lot of people, not just sort of with the politics of it, but also kind of to kind of reflect on what life is really about and that sort of thing.
Well, it didn't help that Boris Johnson was out there having parties.
Well, exactly. No,
when everyone else was shut down.
Yeah. Definitely not. I think in terms of other sort of huge events, the war in Ukraine should be mentioned, because I think that reminded the West, that on its doorstep, real evil can break out. We haven't somehow reached some Western secular utopia where suddenly we can all guarantee that we're all going to treat each other kindly, that actually there is a dark side to the human soul. And I think just that's been a very visceral reminder of that. And I just wonder whether some of these things almost have to come together for people to be pointed back in the direction of the fact that, that we are human beings with light and dark within us, that we are made for something, that we do have an ultimate identity, that we can't simply invent it for ourselves, and that when we try to, it does have these, really difficult results that we've already mentioned. For me, the interesting thing, especially about something like transgender sexuality and identity in general is that I've one of the things I tried to get across in the book is that we never lose our innately religious sensibility. And to some extent, when you get rid of something like the Christian story, it just creates a vacuum where something else will come in. And it's not going to be atheist materialism. Only a tiny number of people really converted to a kind of thoroughgoing atheist materialism.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about next. Was we're not really dealing with that many atheists anymore. We have all these nuns, and it's NONES, not like Catholic nuns, but people who just don't feel like they settle into a particular faith. Is that why? I mean, why do you think?
I think that's right. I think the nuns are actually, you know, the statistics seem to bear this out. They're very rarely people who have signed up to some kind of, you know, strict materialist orthodoxy. They are actually people who are often describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. They're often people who actually do pray, even if they don't subscribe to any particular religion. They're often people who are involved in all kinds of new age and esoteric practices. And obviously, a great deal of them are people who do believe in certain forms of identity. And interestingly, you know, to come back to the transgender thing, I think that has become an example of the way in which certain types of thinking and ideology become almost quasi-religious in themselves, because they do become, you know, sacred to the person who holds that identity, and to question it is to question who they are as an individual. And, you know, at their more activist end, you can, you know, you get the sacred texts and the high priests, and you get those who are on the outside, or the heretics like J.K. Rowling and everything else. You know, you get certain types of even almost forms of religious ritual and, you know, paraphernalia, the pride flag and everything. It inevitably does take on, these things do take on a kind of quasi-religious flavor. And I think that's completely understandable, because people are innately religious. You can't sort of just beat that out of them. So when the new atheists told people, look, you know, forget religion, it's all a load of rubbish, it wasn't, even if they did forget the Christian story, something else was going to kind of come in its place. And what's interesting to me is that so many of those new atheists, the ones you mentioned, for instance, Boghossian and others, they're no longer, you know, fighting against Christianity. They've gone off to fight the culture wars now, because they've actually realized, oh, people are still religious. They're just religious about different things now. And so to me, that's really significant, that we recognize that you're always dealing with religion. It just comes in, you know, different forms at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Well, I'm more in the kind of presuppositional camp when it comes to apologetics. And that's in part because it always kind of comes back to worldview. You know, and I find that approach is maybe a little bit more helpful in pulling that out. You know, it's kind of like even evidence has to be assessed according to worldview. So it sort of becomes the inevitable thing that we have to deal with at some point, which is how does one see the world? So,
yeah.
I wanted to pick your brain just a little bit about, you spent a fair amount of time in the book talking about this sort of, and I'm putting this in quotes, the science and faith dichotomy. But you go into a whole thing about kind of the history of science and how science versus faith is it's a bit of a misrepresentation. We're actually getting ready to have an entire event on this. Dr. James Tour is going to be coming and speaking on this very thing. By the time this airs, I think that probably will have happened. But can you speak to that a little bit? Because I want to make sure you get to talk about all the things that are in the book, and that's a big chunk of the book.
Well, I do try to kind of cover a whole range of different areas where I think the story is changing, where people are pushing back against this atheist materialist kind of perspective and starting to reconsider and reevaluate the Christian story. So I do this across various things that, you know, through history, through the Bible, through the lens of culture. But science is one of them. And again, that's an area where I'd say the new atheism, again, you know, one of its key claims was that science has disproven God. And, you know, the more we know about science, the less reason we have to believe in God. But again, I think that's a very one-sided story. And in fact, if you actually go and look at some of the key advances in science over the last several decades, I think it's been opening up the God question rather than closing it down. You already mentioned the kind of atheist mythology that exists sadly around the history of science and faith. And there's this story, you know, that basically the church was this terrible break on progress and science. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, there are some episodes in the church's history, the Galileo episode and others, which have been spun in that direction, though they're far more nuanced if you actually go and look at them closely. But by and large, the scientific revolution was led by Christians, absolutely, and that's absolutely obvious if you simply go and do the history, read the people, and it's not just because, well, everyone was a Christian back then. It was because they specifically felt called through their Christian faith to examine an ordered universe, and that was their act of worship and devotion to God. So you know, and that happened in the West. It happened in the Christian West. There's a reason why we saw that happen. And likewise, for me, the more I've spoken to some of the leading voices in science, it's become apparent that so many of them are recognizing that you can't just, that the way science works, the way the universe works, the fact that we're here in the universe recognizing science, starting to understand the mechanics of the universe, just doesn't make sense in a purely naturalistic version of reality. So many scientists now are veering, I think, towards something that says, well, there's something more. They're not necessarily putting the word God on that,
Sure.
but they are talking about a principle. You know, one of the people I talk about in the book is Paul Davies, who's a well-respected physicist and works on the Origin Center at Arizona State University. And he, you know, he talks, you know, quite openly about how there's a quasi-religious flavor to some of what he sees going on in the sciences, where there's this sort of life principle, this kind of arrow of comprehensibility at work in the universe and in us, which he recognizes just doesn't make sense in a purely atheistic, naturalistic account of reality. So I just find those stories fascinating, and I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that actually, when you go and look at these things, it's a lot closer to the Christian story than we sometimes realize.
Yeah, no, I love that. Okay, so when you were writing the book, and I'm wonder if I know which one you're going to say, but what is one of your favorite stories as you've been researching and talking to people of an unexpected conversion to Christianity?
Yeah, there's so many interesting ones that I've come across. Perhaps one that stuck with me, just because I've interviewed him a couple of times recently, is a guy called Paul Kingsnorth.
That's what I was thinking you were going to say.
You think? Oh, there you go. You guessed right. You guessed right.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
it's a great story.
I talk about his story a little bit in the final chapter of the book, but he's one of these fascinating characters. Paul Kingsnorth is a celebrated author and poet here in the UK, but he has just only about 3 years ago come to a very committed Christian faith himself, having gone through periods of a kind of teenage atheism at one point, into Zen Buddhism, and then going off into Wicca, and all the time he will tell you he was basically looking for a way of worshipping something, and he kind of tried to look inside himself, and then he tried to worship nature in Wicca, and then but none of it satisfied, and eventually he could only make sense of himself and his whole journey when he finally found it in the last place he thought he would find it, which was Christianity. You know, he really thought that, you know, that was done and dusted, that, you know, that was just a relic of his sort of childhood, you know, for Sunday schools in assembly and that kind of thing. But yeah, he had this very unusual, quite surprising, quite dramatic conversion to Christianity. It wasn't just an intellectual journey by any means. It was there was a number of dreams that were involved in bringing him to that point. There were a number of people who kind of spoke into his life. Even his wife at one point said, quite out of the blue over dinner one day, "You're going to become a Christian." And he said, "What on earth do you mean? Why would you say that?" But it happened. And I find his story just so interesting, because again, he himself would say, if you had told me this a few years ago, I would have laughed you out of the room. And yet here he is. He's found his home, interestingly, in sort of one of the most ancient sort of branches of the Christian church, the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And what's interesting to me is that many of these public intellectuals like Kingsnorth are kind of going to that, as it were, that kind of well, if you like, that sort of form of Christian Christian tradition, because for some reason it speaks very deeply to them. And Kingsnorth will tell you, obviously he takes a, you know, at one level, a very intellectual approach to life. He's a brilliant writer, thinker, and so on. But at the same time, it's not simply an intellectual thing. It speaks to him in a very direct, experiential way. He just talks about the way that the devotional kind of life of the Eastern Orthodox liturgy just makes sense of him as a person in a way that everything else he tried just failed to do so. So yeah, he's one example, I think, of interesting characters. And I've since writing the book, since I kind of finished the thing, I've bumped into about 6 or 7 more hugely interesting stories that if I'd had time, I would have fitted into the book as well. But I just keep bumping into more and more people who kind of I guess just contradict that basic assumption these days that, well, thinking people are abandoning Christianity. I just see traffic in the other direction that makes me wonder, is there an alternative story going on?
Yeah.
I'm hoping Christianity basically becomes the new punk. Right. So basically, at some point, we are the rebellious, and this kind of does go back to some of that COVID stuff and whatnot. Like, we are kind of the rebellious group of misfits who are like, no, this is, and so we become kind of cool to, because we're actually the ones actually standing up to the man. We're not the man, so to speak, anymore.
I think that you should actually merge actual punk and this kind of punk, and you should get like a mohawk and diet blue and.
But like
for the cause.
Looking like this is punk now. That's the thing, so
absolutely.
Mohawks are so passe. Let me ask just one last question. I know we may be somewhat short on time, and I don't want to derail too much. But which God? Which is, for example, another example of I think this movement would be like in America. There's a YouTuber named Tim Pool. He has kind of a politics news show, and he'll often say, "I'm not a Christian, but I believe in God." And so if I were in the room with him, and he has very devout Roman Catholics who are friends that are guests and so on and so forth. But if I were in the room, I'd be like, well, who is this God? What are his attributes? What does he look like? How do you know who he is? How has he revealed himself? So when you talk about kind of this return to belief in God, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. And I think there is a danger that you can sort of be understood to just be talking about some vague, numinous version of God. Yeah. And I don't think actually I'd agree with you. I don't think that helps anyone a great deal, because we can more or less make God in whatever way we like, if that's where we're going. Inevitably, I mean, I am obviously talking about the Christian God, and frankly, I think most of the most interesting public intellectuals out there are also talking about that God, because that is the tradition which has made sense of the Western world. So just to name another of these people that I focus on in the book, Tom Holland is a historian. He co-hosts one of the most popular history podcasts in the world, The Rest is History. But he wrote this extraordinary book, Dominion, a few years ago, in which he basically spelled out the way in which he, as a secular agnostic historian, came to realize, as he investigated the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans, that all of his sensibilities, his values as a Westerner, they didn't come from the Greeks and Romans. They came from the Christian Revolution. He saw for himself just what a difference Jesus Christ made 2,000 years ago, and the ripple effects of that right up to himself. And he said, I realized that in almost every way I am a Christian. And so if you're asking which God, the reality is, if you believe in human equality, dignity, freedom, most of the values that the Western are enshrined in, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or, the Declaration of Independence, they are essentially Judeo-Christian, and you just can't get away from that. And so for me, if you're kind of, if those are the things that you kind of are holding on to and saying this, we need to get back to this, or, where's the world going without this, it's probably Jesus Christ is the person that you're actually looking for. I mean, that's not necessarily the only reason why you would want to opt for the Christian God of all the gods that are on offer. But if you do value the things that these people seem to value, then it simply is the Christian story that gave you those values.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, but when you were talking about King's North, I had underlined several of the passages of that section because I found it really interesting and moving. And I love this line. It says, he's talking about when he left Wicca, which was sort of the final step before he became a Christian. He says, I felt like I was physically dragged out of Wicca, actually. There's all sorts of strange forces at work that people are not necessarily aware of. I had really been looking for God, and Christ had come to find me. Ooh, it's such a great line. Because he's on this search, and he takes a very wayward, weird, winding path, right? But all the while, he was being pursued by the real God. and he names it. I mean, he says Christ. He doesn't just say the God blob, which I was thankful for that. So if this really is happening, if the tide is turning, and by the way, you should get the book because there's a beautiful reference, which I didn't ask about because I want you to read it in the book, of this famous poem. And Justin, you weave it into this idea of the tide turning, and it's quite lovely. But if this really is happening and people are starting, especially kind of on these intellectual planes where they're searching for truth and they're realizing, right, that the Christian God might make the most sense of all of this, how can we as Christians, as the church, be prepared for those that are kind of in exploration mode, spiritually curious? We use that term in our tagline, right? The spiritually curious. How can we best receive them and make it as sort of painless as possible or interesting as possible? I don't even know. What should be our approach?
Well, I think you guys are a great example of doing this, because I think you're creating a space for people to explore, to have questions, and I think that's essential. And I'm really glad to see the way that many more churches and Christian ministries are doing that. They're kind of not feeling like someone has to come with all the correct answers before they can talk to someone. We need to be open to the fact that people are coming from all kinds of different places. They're going to come with a lot of baggage. They're not going to necessarily be in the same place as us, and just be open to that exploration, that journey, and go on it with them. It's a case of being, I think, really gracious. The fact is, we live in a culture which isn't very gracious sometimes, where if you don't agree with me on X, Y, and Z, you will be cancelled or whatever. The church has to be a counter to that, and we have to be an antidote to that kind of graceless cancel culture. We've got to be ready to take people where they are and just help them on a journey, and accept that they may not land up necessarily in the same place as us. But I think in doing that, I think the way we can help to kind of help people experience what the Christian story is really about is by not simply offering them kind of apologetics, i.e. the kind that we were offering in the heyday of the new atheism. Here's 3 philosophical reasons why God exists and 5 reasons to believe Jesus rose from the dead. I think what I've increasingly come to understand is that you have to kind of show why people would want Christianity to be true, why it might be the thing that actually is answering their story. I think that's, in Paul Kingsnorth's case, I think he gradually started to see the way in which he wanted this to be true. It wasn't an intellectual argument per se that took him across the line. It was the fact that this story made sense of him. This story made sense of all his longings and desires and the things he'd been chasing after. And I think that can be done in all kinds of ways. It can be done through art and music and film and literature. I think it was Blaise Pascal who said something like, make good men desire that religion is true, then show them that it is true. So it's something about engaging the imagination, making people want this to be true in the way C.S. Lewis did, with Narnia. He created a world that people wanted to be true. And then he said, well, guess what? It is true. It does exist in our world. And for me, that's really important to kind of get both of those right, the imagination and the kind of intellectual apologetic side of things. And then just tell your story well, don't duck it. Another thing that a lot of these public intellectuals who are kind of quite engaged with or interested in Christianity, maybe even have started to explore going to church. One thing that they've said to me repeatedly is keep Christianity weird. Don't water it down. Don't give us some kind of warmed over humanist version of Christianity, please. We've got enough of that already. We don't need, they want the mystery, they want the depth, they want the weirdness of all the claims. And so I think that's important to remember that we have this unique story. It is extraordinary and weird in many ways, but actually that's part of its appeal in the end. It's different to, Tom Holland, when I've talked to him about his sort of journey with faith, he said, I've just find the kind of secular material story of reality boring. It's pallid, it's anemic. I'd much rather the Christian story was true. Now, where he is, as I say, I'm not the one to judge, but give people something that they would love to be true and make it as magical as it is. So those are just a few ways that I would say we need to engage this.
That's great. Any last questions from you?
Real quick, you hosted a show with Sean McDowell and a gentleman from Canada whose name I cannot remember, but he has the same exact name as another scholar in Canada who studies the same exact thing, which is really bizarre. But it was about the end of apologetics. I don't know if you remember that episode.
Oh yeah, this
I
was
had
years and years ago.
the Canadian gentleman on our show maybe a year ago, and I'm
Mm.
wondering if maybe that, because what you said just now was really interesting, because I found the argument that we have come to some degree to a kind of an end of apologetics kind of to be true. Not just that we model like being nice people and, you know, or something like that, but like there's a kind of limit to what we can achieve with apologetics. Anyway, I thought that was a really interesting episode. People should find it on the Unbelievable Archive. And what you said just kind of reminded me of it, because it's I don't know what age we're in exactly, but it's somewhere between like purely rational arguments and lifestyle Christianity, and it's a fun time to be alive. But what you said, I think, about giving people something to look forward to or aspire to is very helpful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I know that the one you're talking about, and I can't quite recall the name of the other guest either off the top of my head. But no, I think that's right. And I remember the subtitle of the gentleman's book was no argument for Christianity, and there was a sort of sense in which I understood what he was saying, that yes, of course there are arguments for Christianity, but ultimately it's not arguments that persuade people in the end. It comes from a different place. And so I would say I'm invested in the intellectual side of things. I think apologetics can be really useful, but what it tends to be most useful for, in my experience, is removing roadblocks. So maybe that someone has an issue with the problem of evil. Well, if you can, perhaps for some people, there might be some rational evidences that will help with that. Maybe they're not sure if, you know, we can trust the New Testament. Well, there might be some scholarship you can offer to help with that. But none of that will make them walk down the road. You can remove roadblocks, but there has to be something that's more about their imagination and a spiritual encounter that makes them want to walk down the road to Jesus. So for me, it's there's no argument that will ultimately just send you down that road. It's you've got to want what's on offer, you know.
I have to plug one more episode. I'm so sorry. The episode you did with Richard Swinburne and Bart Ehrman.
Oh,
on the problem of evil.
You're going really back in the archives now.
It's way back. I've listened to it many times. I have Richard Swinburne's book. People should track that one down too, because that was a really interesting. I'll never forget Richard Swinburne, who's also Orthodox, and he talked about how God wants us to be holy, and it was such a contrast of the what the unbeliever thinks man should become, or his height of what he'll be, and what the Christian sees man as, and what God wants of him. It's an excellent interview, debate. People should find that.
Okay, great.
Funny. Now you have me thinking of all the debates.
I know. Sorry. I got to put the mic away now.
No. It's all good. Before we close out, an idea that I would love to pick your brain about, or maybe, you know, as you're doing more work with this online or engaging with people, if you ever come up with a series of questions that you could ask people in this kind of space that we're talking about, I would love to get my hands on that. What I mean is, I have teenagers. And so I'm in the world of hearing teenagers talk about big things. And then I also host various conversation groups of people that are not on Team Jesus, as I say, but they're exploring big ideas. And in this new way of thinking, I mean, this idea you're talking about, being imaginative, keeping it weird, not diluting it and making it anemic, as you say. I would love to have just some starter questions, you know. I mean, I can think of some even now, but it could be a fun project to come up with a list of like 10 things that you could ask at a dinner party or salon kind of idea, you know.
I think that's a great idea. Now I don't have that list to hand, because this book is much more at the kind of tracing out the hopeful genesis of something that may be happening. I mean, we have a mutual friend in Andy Bannister who was around this time has also published a similar book. It's called How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. And it's really good. And he is great with that kind of very practical, down to earth stuff. He does this great thing of kind of suggesting, have you ever wondered questions. That's a great way into having conversations where you don't start with, you know, are you saved? Do you believe in Jesus? But it's about actually just engaging with someone's interests and the things that they are passionate about. And I think that's an excellent way in for folk who are kind of looking for meaning and purpose, and have an inkling that there might be more to life than the kind of the atheist materialist story told us. I think start where they are, start with their passions, and somewhere along the line, I think you'll get back to the fact that that somehow is reflected ultimately in the greatest story ever told, that there is a story that reflects who they are and what they're most interested in. So yeah, that might be a good place to start. The have you ever wondered why questions.
Yeah, that's good. Well, if people want to find you, engage with you, buy all of your books, listen to all your past episodes, what's the easiest way to find Justin Brierley and engage with you on these things?
Well, my website is a great place to go, justinbrierley.com. And you can find a link there to the new book. You can pre-order it from there. It helps if you do it via my website, actually. I see a tiny little bit of extra profit on the book if you go via the website.
That's
I've also got signed copies as well available there if anyone wants it that way. So justinbrierley.com and click through to the book. I'm not sure when this episode is going to air, but we're also going to be creating a new podcast documentary series based on the book, which will be coming out, we hope, around the same time as the book in September. So do look out for that. Cool. If you're a podcast listener, if you've enjoyed things like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast or the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, those kind of documentary podcast type pieces, this is very much the way we'll be doing this. It'll be the book, but kind of with lots more stories, lots more interesting people that we engage. So look out for that as well.
I love that. Brierley has 2 E's. I'm constantly wanting to put a Y after the L, but there's another E there. So Justin Brierley with 2 E's. And if you're curious about what we do here in Houston and then the podcast, everything you need to know about us, you can find at Houston TOT. That's for Theology on Tap, HoustonTOT.com. And if you live in the Houston area, or if you're visiting, we'd love to have you come visit one of our events. Justin, when you're in Houston, we'd love to take you out for a beer or maybe have you come to one of our events as well. But HoustonTOT.com for everything you need to know. And of course, feel free to give while you're there so we can keep doing more of this. But until we see you again and engage in more of these ideas, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.